Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and Season 3 content is finally here. For the Mythic Plus season in particular, this means we got a whole new slew of dungeons for us to dive back into. Some are going to be returning dungeons voted by the community, while the other dungeons are actually going to be some new additions, with things like Ika do Moldani, the return of Tazavesh, as well as the Shadowlands dungeon of Halls of Atonement. And with a brand new season of M+, I wanted to put together a dungeon guide for the Season 3 content. Part of this guide is going to be a refresher for familiar War Within dungeons, but also a guide to some of the new mechanics from returning instances, and is going to give you all of the important boss information needed in order to be able to succeed in those instances for this season of M+ content. It is a long video, so I'll have chapter marks down below, so if you want to skip around to all the different dungeons and reference them later, you're more than welcome to do so. With that, if you guys enjoy guides like these and want to see more of them for the patch 11.1, as well as any of the coverage of announcements for Midnight, which should be coming out sometime soon, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. Now, a portion of the seasonal dungeons are actually going to be a bit of a refresher, while some of them are going to be actually kind of new, with the first 4 being the ones that the community voted for. So let's go over those refresher War Within dungeons first, starting out with Ara-Kara, the City of Echoes. The first boss is Avonox, which is a pretty simple encounter that the spider, one thing is going to do is slap the tank a lot with a Voracious Bite ability, increasing the tank's damage taken afterwards, so the tank is going to take quite a lot of damage from this encounter immediately. The boss pretty early on is going to use an ability called Alerting Shrill, which does a lot of AoE damage and spawn 4 adds. Though before the ads spawn, you can actually see cocoons where the eggs are, telling you exactly where the ads are going to spawn, so you can position the boss away from the ads, and you'll want to do that because if the boss ever gets near those ads, it's going to eat them, getting more damage. Those little ads actually do a decent bit of damage, but they'll fixate on very specific players, and what you want to do with those to deal with them is to crowd control them really quickly, lock them down, AoE them down, and then get back to the boss. After the ad spawn shortly afterwards, the boss is going to start an attack called Gossamer Onslaught, which will deal a decent bit of AoE damage, but also will spawn vile webs on players' location. However, if you're grouped up and you put these webs all the way to the side, you can actually contain where these webs are. As the fight goes on, the longer the fight goes on, the more these webs are going to spread, so you kind of want to keep them compact and away from the center of the boss arena so you can have a little bit easier time maneuvering the boss around. And don't stand the vile webbing as best you can, so try to stack those and put them away to the side, better yet even the edges of the boss room. The second boss is going to be a noob, Zekt, which has a handful of mechanics, but it's also going to be a bit more involved with tanks. Against tanks, he's going to use a frontal ability called Impale, which does a lot of damage, so you want to make sure tanks are not facing this at the rest of the group as best as possible. The boss is also going to cast Infestation, which will be a passing dot, will jump from player to player, which the healer is going to have to be very, very mindful of. The boss also does a burrow charge, usually picking a ranged player on the group and charge towards them, and what you want to do with that ability is run as far away from the boss as best you can, and then try to move last second as he does the charge to try to see if you can avoid it, and some classes can easily avoid it, like a mage being able to blink out of it. The boss will also periodically spawn in bloodstained web mages, which need to be interrupted, grouped together, and killed pretty quickly. Their cast ability is going to root player in place, which is definitely something you don't want to deal with, because the boss is going to cast the ability Eye of the Swarm once he reaches full energy, where he'll actually limit the place where you can stand in the boss arena, where you want to stand in the center, have the tank place the boss away from the rest of the group so it's easier to dodge the frontal, while also dodging the various swarms that are going to be rolling all over the boss arena as you're trying to stay in the safe area while the Eye of the Storm buff lasts. The final boss is going to be Katal the Harvester, who throughout the entire encounter is going to have these blood workers running all across boss arena. Damaging a blood worker causes them to drop a vial of a black blood, which will spread around an area. Any player coming into contact with that black blood, it'll cause the blood to coagulate into an enemy that can then be interrupted or crowd controlled, and while it's holding you in place, it's going to have you rooted. You'll actually want to keep these pools of black blood kind of scattered all throughout the edges of the boss arena, so any range class may actually want to hit those blood workers here and there in order to cause them to spread more black blood all throughout the edges. You'll want to dodge the Erupting Webs ability, that's just something you gotta move out for. Cultivating Poisons will be a poison effect that deals damage over time, and whenever the poison expires, it'll send these poison waves in the direction of where the player is standing, and you'll actually will see cones from the player that will kind of target in the direction that these waves are going to go. You can actually dispel these, and it's better to dispel them early as best as possible in order to have a little bit easier time dodging waves, dodging some of the waves now and some waves later instead of all the waves at once, which makes it a little bit more hectic. The boss also casts Cosmic Singularity, which will slowly pull the players towards it with a one big pull towards the end to one-shot any nearby players. You want to step in the Black Blood to get rooted, or use some sort of a movement skill last second to escape the pull-in effect. The next dungeon is going to be the Dawnbreaker, which is yet another 3-boss instance. From the get-go with Dawnbreaker, it is a sky-riding dungeon where you can use your mouse to fly around through a portion of the instance. However, you don't need to be in sky-riding mode if that is not your preferable choice of transportation. Like, if you're someone who simply just doesn't enjoy the fast-paced riding of skyriding, you could actually switch over to steady flying, and steady flying mounts will have the same speed as skyriding mounts. This could actually make it a little bit easier for some of the different boss fights, like the first boss for instance, to have a little bit of time, like easier time moving around the air while being able to avoid some of the different abilities and being able to position your character a little bit better throughout this whole dungeon. Now, for the first boss, we're going to have the Speaker Shadow Crown, which is going to be the first skywriting boss fight. With the boss, we're going to have an Obsidian Beam, which we'll want to dodge whenever the beam is active. During the first phase, there's only 3 beams from the boss. During second, there is 4, so it gets a little bit more hectic towards the tail end. The boss also casts Collapsing Night on 2 players, with expanding portals that will continue to expand and will linger throughout the encounter. You'll want ranged players and healers to try to see if you can stay away from the boss as best possible majority of the encounter, so you can bait these collapsing night portals away. And you also want to move the boss away from collapsing portals, because those collapsing portals and Obsidian Beam tend to overlap quite often, so if you want to make sure you have plenty of space to stand in safety, you want to keep the boss at bay. You also have the boss cast an ability called Burning Shadows, which once dispelled will deal a little bit of damage, but also put a debuff on every player that needs to be healed through, otherwise it keeps consuming their health bar over time. So a healer, as soon as you dispel, you need massive AoE healing as best as possible. You also have Shadow Bolt, which needs to be interrupted, which is primarily usually cast at the tank. At 50% and at 1%, the boss uses Darkness Comes, where you need to mount up and fly away from the main airship to pick up these radiant orbs to stay in the air and stay away from the ship until the cast is finally finished. Standing anywhere near close to the ship before the cast finishes can potentially one-shot you, and you really should have some generous space away from the boat, away from the airship before the cast finishes. Don't be greedy, don't get too close, because that is how you can get easily clapped by this mechanic. The second boss of the dungeon will be a noob Ikaj. Before you slay the boss, you'll actually have to kill empowered Nerubians throughout Mereldar to spawn the boss. And any of the mechanics that these empowered Nerubians do, the boss will have exactly the same mechanics. So things like Dark Orb, you'll need to face it away, like with the empowered Nerubians, away from the group, and make sure it doesn't hit a wall, as you want the orb to travel as far as possible to reduce its fall off damage. Terrifying Slam is going to be a slam on the tank, where the tank needs to move away from the group to avoid cleaving the party and putting him in fear. Shadow Decay is going to be big, rampant AoE damage that will gain strength with every pulse, so it's a big healer, heal the group angle. Animate Shadows will be a unique ability to the boss specifically that the empowered Nerubians do not do, where he'll target a player and spawn little ads around them. You want to CC those ads and cleave them down as quickly as possible before they start to cast additional damage. The final boss of this dungeon will be Rashanon, which is the same raid boss from the Nuremberg Palace. You'll have, first of all, a phase 1 of the fight on the boat, and a phase 2 later on the ground. During phase 1, he'll cast abilities like Rolling Acid, which will send a wave that you want to face away from the group. Expel Webs is something you'll want to just simply avoid and dodge, and Erosive Spray will be something that the healer will have to heal through, as it deals group-wide damage with a dot afterwards. During the phase 1 of the fight, the Arathi will spawn bombs at the back of the boss, and you want to take those bombs to the front of the boss, which will deal large amounts of boss damage directly. And after 6 bombs, the boss will then start to fly away. You can either chase up to the boss or just literally fly to the second area if you are aware where the boss is going to be landing. You can fly there directly in order to avoid any of the flying mechanics, if that's what you want to do. During part 2, for the most part, you have exactly the same mechanics, but boss will use one extra ability called Spinneret Strings, where the boss will target 2 players to run out of the group, and you want to run pretty far out. Those players will get hit, and they'll get tethered to a spinneret, and when you run out of the tether, you'll then snap the spinneret, doing more party-wide damage. But you do want to run them out as best as you can, because any spinnerets that get hit by an acid wave will leave an acid pool, and you want to keep those away from the group in order to make sure that you have plenty of room to take down the rest of the boss for the rest of the encounter. Now the next 3 boss dungeon is going to be Priory. First boss being Captain Dalaran, who isn't going to be made available to fight at the very beginning. You first have to eliminate at least 3 officers of the boss before the fight can be pulled. For the boss himself, his priority damage is going to be Pierce Armor, which is going to hit the tank for a bunch of damage and put a heavy bleed. Earth-Shattering Spear is a new ability for this season that's going to be different from that Frontal Spear. It instead will throw a spear at a set location, and you'll kind of want to position the boss around the boss arena to make sure that you're dealing with the Earth-Shatter Spear ground effect. The boss will also cast Battle Cry, which needs to be interrupted, otherwise it's a big damage buff. And the boss's cat will do Savage Mauling, leaping on a player to deal damage to them. You need to deal enough damage to the cat to break the Savage Mauling in order to break through its shield. Then the boss is also going to have an extra officer that will be helping him out through an encounter, either Elena in most cases or Tainer. In most cases, Tainer will be the guy, one of the officers you'll want to take down early, especially if you go left-hand side of the boss area, or I guess the Prior of Sacred Flame area before the first boss, the main courtyard area. So in most cases you won't be fighting Tainer, but if Tainer is the secondary companion to Dalaran in case routes change, he'll have an interrupt that you need to interrupt constantly, a fireball, as well as Amber Storm, which will deal large AoE damage that will leave scorch marks on the ground, making it much harder for you to position around the encounter. That, or the boss will have Elena, which will be likely companion during this encounter, which will have Divine Judgment, which slaps the tank for a ton of damage, putting also a debuff that causes him to take more damage, so that'll be an instant dispel for the healer, as well as Holy Radiance, which just does radiating AoE holy damage, but it's a little bit easier to avoid compared to Ember Storm, which is even more movement mechanics on top of movement mechanics of Captain Dalaran. The next boss is going to be Baron Braunpike, which has a number of abilities such as Hammer of Purity, where you'll drop hammers on player positions, so you want to stack kind of close, and then move together as these hammers will then spin outwards. This is going to be a pretty big boss mover angle. Sacrificial Pyre is going to be another ability where a player will need to run in to soak a pyre, which will leave a pretty hefty dot on him. Usually this is dealt by the tank. Though you don't necessarily need to soak the Sacrificial Pyre immediately, as it actually lingers for quite a decent bit of the encounter. Instead, you actually want to stay away from Sacrificial Pyre for the next ability called Castigator's Shield, where Castigator's Shield will deal damage to everybody, slow every player, as well as drop a big circle that you need to move out of. Usually you'll drop the circles to move in towards the pyre to then gas off the pyre one by one, or have the tank take a bunch of charges and pop a defensive. The boss will also cast Burning Light, which will deal a ton of AoE damage, and heal himself, which will need to be interrupted, which is pretty easy to deal with. Also, periodically, the boss is going to activate Vindictive Wrath. As a Paladin, Braunpike is activating Wings, and when Paladins activate Wings as a player, they do more damage. So his version of Wings is simply going to make all these abilities hit harder and have additional mechanics like more Hammers with Purity, a stronger Castigator Shield, as well as Sacrificial Pyre, which will need 5 soaks instead of 3 soaks. So having some kind of a class with an immunity to grab a couple of soaks, pop an immunity, grab a couple more is also recommended. The final boss of this dungeon is Prior's Murpray, which has 2 phases, but they're basically the same. In the first phase, she's going to cast abilities such as Sacred Flame, which will place a beam on a player, and you want to run that beam away from the group as it will leave puddles on the ground. Holy Smite is an attack she's mostly going to target at the tank, though it can be easily interrupted. Holy Flame will leave a circle on the ground, which needs to be dodged by everybody. Inner Flame is going to be a boss amp, which just deals more damage, which the healer will need to be careful of. And Blinding Light will be an attack where everybody will want to face away. Though even as you face away the boss, it'll still deal decent group-wide damage either way. When the boss hits 50%, she moves to the top of the stairs and channels Embrace the Light while covered by Barrier of Light. You want to break the barrier to be able to interrupt her Embrace the Light ability. During this channel, she also summons Arathi Neophytes, which don't really need to be DPS'd. It's better to actually crowd control them. Roots, slows, anything to keep them away from the group, as these neophytes will slowly melt themselves. If any neophytes do reach the group, they deal a lot of damage to both tanks and the rest of the group, so it's really best to try to keep them away from the boss and run away from them as best as possible. In phase 2, basically the fight continues on as in phase 1, but you have a bit more of a narrower area to deal with when it comes to finishing out the encounter, specifically when it comes to the Sacred Flame, kind of leaving puddles all over the ground. The final War Within dungeon is going to be Operation Floodgate, and the first 2 bosses of Floodgate can actually be done in any order. I've been in groups that did Big Mama first, and I've been in groups that done Demolition Duo, but there's a little bit of customization in terms of how you want to do your runs, which gives the groups quite a bit of freedom to work with. But the first boss I do want to cover is Big Mama, which is mostly an ad fight with a burst window. The boss slaps the tank pretty hard with the Electric Crush ability, so tanks need to be very careful with Electric Crush in particular, and you may want to rotate pretty big defensive for every single one of these. Sonic Boom, the boss is going to fixate on a random player and hit him with a Sonic Boom, which you'll want to face away from the group, as Sonic Boom will silence any player in the area and push him away from the boss, but if you have movement abilities, you should be able to face it away and then get around the ability to avoid taking damage or the pushback. The ads are also present throughout the encounter, and the ads will deal a bit of damage, but sometimes we'll also have a cast which needs to be interrupted. For the most part, you want to AoE the ads and avoid any of their linear frontal circle attacks. If the boss reaches 100% energy, she activates Kill or Block Barrier, so she basically becomes nearly immune. And the only way to break the barrier in order to get the boss to reset with a jump start is to kill all the ads. So you want to kill the ads before she gets Kill or Block Barrier. Once the ads are dead, she uses Jumpstart, dealing a lot of AoE damage, but also taking a ton of damage during this window. So this is a great opportunity for you to lust and burn your cooldowns into the boss. This also Jumpstart resets her bar for Kill or Block Barrier and resummons the ads all over again, but also leaves a puddle on the ground, so you'll want to maneuver the boss away from the puddle, but keeping her kind of near the puddle in order to limit the amount of space that she's able to block off after every single Jumpstart. The other boss at the start of the instance is Demolition Duo, which has 2 bosses. He's Quick Fuse and Bront, which have different abilities. For Kiza, periodically throughout the encounter, she'll drop bombs, which need to be cleared before they explode, and they can get cleared only through 2 abilities. One of which being Kinetic Explosive Gel, which does a lot of damage to the target that needs to be healed, but a healer also needs to dispel that target, but also the gel has an AoE circle around it, and any bombs caught in that dispel circle will also be cleared by the gel. So you want to run into a stack of bombs with the gel as soon as you have it. Quick Shot from the boss is going to deal quite a large bit of damage, so the healer is going to have to be very careful with who Kiza focuses on. And BBBFG is a linear attack that is fairly easy to dodge. Bront, on the other hand, is for the most part going to focus on the tank and will slap the tank with a wallop, which deals a decent bit of damage. He also does a barreling charge where he'll pick a player and you'll be able to aim where Bront charges through, and those charges can help clear bombs. So you want to avoid being charged through it, and want to make sure to aim Bront with those charges. His third charge always targets the tank, so if you have any bombs that are still need to be cleared, the tank should be in charge of the very last charge, and he does 3 of those charges every time he does it. Whenever any of these bosses die, however, the boss that is currently active will start to get a rampant damage buff. So you want to try to kill Kiza and Bront pretty evenly with one another. But if you do leave any one of them alive, I think it is definitely easier to leave Bront alive because he just mostly does tank damage, while Kiza will deal damage to everybody. So if you do want to focus on anybody, I would suggest focusing Kiza first, but definitely try to cleave him as evenly as possible. The third boss of the dungeon will be Swampface, and his main mechanic is Razor Choke Vines, where he'll tie players together, linking 2 sets of 2 players, so 4 players together, usually avoiding healer as part of the link, so the healers have a little bit more freedom with positioning. While players are linked, if you try to run too far away from each other, it springs players together, so you want to move together as a group. The boss is also going to hit the tank pretty hard with Sludge Claws, which does a lot of damage and also has some healing prevention to the tank, so you want to have a defensive for that every single time. The boss also will cast Mudslide at a random player, and players that are linked together always want to move to the left facing the boss, or rather clockwise around the boss. You want to make sure you have your direction saved every single time, so you move in to one side together every single time for that ability and just coordinate it together. Though something you could do that's pretty fun is have a healer stay away from the group to potentially bait a Mudslide away from the players that are tethered with Choke Vines. Also, the boss will use an ability called Awaken the Swamp when you reach his max energy, which will deal a lot of AoE damage and will send out these water waves that needs to be dodged. This is a pretty good angle to pop a defensive or a big healing cooldown. The final boss of Operation Floodgate is Gizel Gigazap, and you could try saying that name 5 times fast. He has an ability at the start he'll use is Turbo Charger, which does a lot of AoE damage and will send these frontal lines that need to be dodged, and the boss will continue resetting to turbocharge every so often. The tank is going to get hit with a Thunder Punch, which does a lot of damage and knocks you back, so you want to make sure you're facing your back towards a ramp or towards one of the walls. There's only so many walls in that instance. Gigazap will also be a big hit that will target 2 players that need to spread away from each other and away from any water puddles on the ground. Gigazap will deal a ton of damage, so it's a good angle for a big healing cooldown or a defensive. The dam is also going to rattle from time to time, dropping down water puddles on the ground. You want to make sure not to electrify any water with a Thunder Punch or Gigazap or any of his other abilities as best as possible, and you want to save him for his ability called Leaping Spark, where you'll create these sparks that will fixate on players and will keep leaping towards the player until they reach him. But if there's a water in between all of the leaping spark and the player, then the water will absorb the spark and remove the spark out of circulation for the encounter. So you want to try to keep all the water puddles as healthy and non-electrified as best as you can, so you can bait those leaping sparks into those water puddles. From here, we have 4 new dungeons for the season, with the first one being Ecodome Aldani, yet another 3-boss encounter with the first boss of Ara-Kara. At least that's how I think you pronounce it. I'm pretty sure I got it wrong completely, but I'm not going to try it again. Ara-Kara is what I choose to call him. For this boss, the tank will need to stay near the boss at all times, or he casts an ability of Thrash, and that's essentially all the tank needs to do besides crowd control. The boss periodically is going to cast Invading Shriek, which will spawn a bunch of ads which will leap around everybody in the group. So you want to stack them together and CC the ads and nuke them down while staying next to the boss. The boss is also going to pick 2 players at a time with a Toxic Regurgitation, where you want to run out with a big circle to drop a puddle away from the boss and run back in, and that Toxic Regurgitation is also going to leave a dot on you, so the healer will have to be very, very careful of those players with that dot. At 100 energy, the boss will cast Devour, so you don't want to stay next to the boss in melee, but you can still stay close enough so you can still hit him, but you don't want to be in that Devour circle or the boss will kill you instantly. During that time, the boss will also summon a couple of ads that will begin getting slowly drawn towards the boss. You'll want to stun those ads and AoE them down very, very quickly so they don't reach the boss in the middle, because every target that the boss devours, he gains additional damage. The next boss is going to be yet another one that I'm going to have a hard time pronouncing, Tabat and Awaj, which is the best I can do with that name. The boss itself is going to be 2 bosses in one primarily. There is an opportunity where they get to split from each other, but for the most part, they kind of just act as one boss at the same time. For the most part, it's going to be Tabat riding Awaj, and they're going to act as one, hitting the tank with Rift Claws, which deals a lot of damage. Then there's also an ability to Warp Strike, where he targets a player and will rush through everybody in the path. The player getting hit by it needs to be healed, but everybody else should try to avoid getting hit by the frontal line. The boss will also cast Binding Javelin at 2 players, so you want to kind of stand close to each other, not on top of each other, but near another, so the javelins are nearby without clipping each other with your own circles. And you want to break these javelins as quickly as possible, and that's an opportunity to stack the boss on top of the javelins to cleave everything evenly. When the boss reaches 100 energy, he'll cast Arcane Blitz, where Tabat actually jumps off Awaj and he'll become immune. Awaj is going to create images and clones of himself that need to be rushed through Tabat in order to remove his immunity debuff after a number of charges. This is where both bosses are going to be stunned and both can be hit. Both bosses actually share damage between each other, so it's an opportunity for double damage with the Beastmaster's Bond while both of them are stunned. Before then the reset and the fight continues on as it was before. The final encounter is Soul Scribe, and throughout the encounter she'll cast Whispers of Fate, where Soul Scribe will be able to try to summon up and attack players' echoes, where players can either absorb the echo to get a damage buff or miss it and get hit by Soul Scribe, which will deal damage to the player and will cause it to deal less damage. So throughout the encounter you want to be picking up your own echoes for every one of the boss's big attacks. One of those attacks being Ceremonial Dagger, which creates these lines. You want to avoid the lines, but also you want to go soak your echo during that time. Dread of the Unknown is a circular attack where players will want to spread out away from each other, but also during that time you want to grab your echo and then spread fairly quickly. Then there's the big attack called Eternal Weave, which will make these massive conal attacks and will spawn 3 echoes, trying to attack these echoes over a number of frontal attacks. You want to pick up your echoes while avoiding these frontals, and during this phase you can actually stagger picking up those echoes to prolong your damage amp, or you can pick them up at once if that's what you want to do. But this phase lasts for quite a decent bit of time, so staggering him is best, but if you have a hard time avoiding the frontals, it is a lot better to pick up your echoes early than to have them get hit by any of the frontals instead. Also, throughout the entire encounter, for healers, the boss will be pulsating with Echoes of Fate, where players will be taking constant AoE raid group-wide damage of Arcane, so that's something for you to heal throughout the entirety of the encounter. Another returning dungeon is Halls of Atonement from the expansion of Shadowlands, and out of all the Shadowlands dungeons, this one was definitely a fan favorite from back in the day, just because it was one of the easier and more engaging dungeons from that era. The first boss is going to be Halkias, the Sin-Stained Goliath, but before Halkias can be activated, you first need to destroy 3 Sin-Stone elites scattered throughout the first part of the dungeon before Halkias becomes attackable. Halkias is a fairly straightforward fight, which has the mechanic of Light of Atonement, which means players can get too far away from Halkias. He'll have this massive red circle, and you want to stand within that red circle to make sure that you don't get hit by fears that will just run you in random directions. The boss is going to use abilities like Crumbling Slam, usually slapping the tank pretty hard, but also leaving puddles on the ground, and heave debris at a random player to also toss out, dealing AoE damage and leaving more puddles. So whenever the boss slams the tank with a Crumbling Slam for a puddle, you kind of want the rest of the players being anywhere near those puddles. Before boss's bar reaches max, you will actually want to move the boss away from any puddles in order to have an easier time dodging refracted sunlight, because then there's going to be 4 beams radiating out of the boss and rotating around him, sometimes shifting in directions though, and you want to make sure you are able to avoid those beams while also keeping the boss away from any puddles to make use of the full area of the boss encounter. The next boss is going to be Echelon, where the boss is going to randomly cast Blood Torrent periodically at random players, which just simply means you gotta dodge out of it and it'll leave a puddle on the ground, which will give you with a little bit of less space to work with the longer the encounter goes on. His main mechanic is Stone Call, where you'll summon Undying Stone Fiends. These adds should not be attacked immediately, as at first when they spawn in, they'll try to melee a player, but as soon as they take damage, they'll start casting a spell. So you want to try to limit the amount of damage to them, let them walk towards the center of the boss arena where you can cleave them down. For every ad that dies, however, they don't necessarily die, but they turn into stone. And when they turn to stone, they'll deal quite a decent bit of AoE damage for your healer to be aware of. But you generally want to try to stack those adds together and nuke them down fairly well together, usually using a defensive or a healing cooldown to deal with the AoE damage, but you want to have those adds turn to stone together in a one big pile clump. The boss will then periodically cast Flesh to Stone, trying to turn one player into stone, and you want to make sure that nobody's standing next to that player. You want to take the Flesh to Stone debuff on top of those adds, because then the boss will use Stone Shattering Leap on that player that turns to stone, dealing quite a decent bit of damage to them, but also leaving it out on them, and any fiends that are turned to stone that are hit by the leap are actually permanently dead. The boss will continue to summon these Undying Stone Fiends throughout the encounter, and if you're not clearing them, you can easily get overrun by so many different adds, which means even more AoE damage, as when they quote-unquote die, turn to stone, dealing even more damage to the rest of the group. So you want to try to group up those adds, turn them to stone, have the person with Flesh of Stone get leapt on to break the adds to make it easier to get through the encounter. The next boss is High Educator Elise, which has a number of mechanics. First of all, she has a casted effect at the tank with Anima Bolt, which does large amounts of shadow damage, but at least it can be interrupted, and you'll want to have a rotation to make sure the tank doesn't immediately die. Periodically, the boss is going to cast Anima Fountain, which will just be a lot of avoidable AoE damage. But you'll also afflict 2 players with Unstable Anima. Those players with Unstable Anima will radiate AoE damage to everybody around them, so you want to spread. And you can have the healer at least dispel one player and then the other in order to limit the AoE damage from this effect. Shadow Procession is going to be an ability she'll use pretty regularly, where she'll spawn a ghost in the center of the arena that will fix it at one of the players. You want to take the ghost to a Vessel of Atonement, which will be these big anime cages, and usually she'll have 4 of them at the start of the arena, with these cages slowly recuperating themselves as the fight goes on. But it is a little bit slower. Like after the first 4 cages are up, it takes a little bit of time before more cages spawn. So as the fight goes on, the first 4 ghosts can be easily dealt with, but future ghosts will end up lingering for quite a while. And while a ghost is lingering, it deals constant pulsating AoE damage, which over time can be fairly overwhelming. So this is a great boss to use all of your single target cooldowns on, and potentially even less to get through this fight as quickly as possible. The final boss of this dungeon will be Lord Chamberlain, who has a number of mechanics, first one being telekinetic toss. We'll pick up one of the statues and toss it towards a player, but there should be a big red arrow to tell you which player it's getting tossed at, and those should be made pretty easy to avoid. Another ability he does is Unleash Suffering, which is a frontal, so you kind of want to keep the boss in the center of the boss arena, so it's a little bit easier for you to dodge around this frontal. Eruptive Torment is something he will also cast periodically. Well, he creates circles under him as well as under all other statues, which will explode after a while. So you want to have some kind of a mobility cooldown in order to escape the circles fairly quickly, and be careful of positional with any of those other statues. At 70% and 40% health, the boss is going to cast the ability of Chamberlain's Chorus, where he'll take all the statues near him in either an X formation or a plus formation, and then send them flying out in that same direction. Afterwards, the boss is going to channel towards those statues, and if any of that channel continues to channel on the statues, it'll deal large amounts of group-wide damage. What players will want to do is stand between him and those lines and channels towards the statues to hit the players instead of statues, doing single target damage to every player with the beam instead of doing raid-wide damage. In most cases, you could actually have a tank stand in the boss's hitbox to take 2 beams onto himself instead of every player or 4 players taking a beam, which can help reduce some of the damage taken as long as the tank has a decent defensive cooldown to use. Now the final dungeon is going to be split up into 2 instances, Tazavesh Streets and Tazavesh Gambit. And I am going to separate this dungeon in those because you'll be running Streets or Gambit as a separate keystone. The Streets is going to be the first 5 boss encounters, starting with Zofex the Sentinel. The Zofex is a boss that is either armed or unarmed, where she has multiple arms that will deal damage, either spinning as blades all throughout the boss arena, or attached to the boss where he can hit the tank quite for a decent bit of additional damage. Impound Contraband is something he's going to cast periodically, which will disarm a player, silence them completely, and you'll want to retrieve your weapon, which will be with a big glowing platform, and you'll see your weapon model actually in that platform. Then the boss will also go on to use a new ability that he didn't have in Shadowlands called Charge Slash, which is just a big frontal that needs to be dodged, so players should want to try to position themselves near the boss to make it easier to dodge that AoE conal ability. The boss's main big ability is going to be Interrogation, which will pick a player to interrogate. Afterwards, the player will be trapped in a jail and fixated on taking continuous damage, while the boss slowly crawls towards the player, just smashing everything in front of him. You want to have the player that's fixated with Interrogation run away from the boss as far as possible, and everybody should try to DPS the jail to break him out of jail before the boss reaches them. The next 3 bosses of Tazavesh, the Grand Menagerie, Maelstrom Mayhem, and Miza's Oasis, can all be done in any order, and there's going to be a little bit of customization as to how you want to plan your routes for the cooldowns, but I am going to go over the order that most players have done them back during Shadowlands and from PTR testing. Usually most players will do the Grand Menagerie boss fight first. During Grand Menagerie, you actually have 3 different bosses for you to deal with, and these bosses will actually come out as the first boss, the second boss, and the third boss are very close to death, about 30 to 25% or so. The first boss is going to be Ulcrux, who places a Gluttony debuff on a target, which will deal slight AoE damage, but also has the potential to consume any animal orbs nearby. This debuff stays with the group for the rest of the encounter, jumping from player to player as the debuff is about to run out. So this is a mechanic that will continue on into the next fights that will become important later. The boss primarily is going to cast 2 abilities, one being Grip of Hunger, where he'll pull all players near him and then explode in AoE. When you get pulled, you want to run away from the boss as quickly as possible. The other ability is going to be Grand Consumption, where these anima orbs will drop slowly from the sky, first blanketing an area with a first set of orbs and then a second set of orbs. After the first set of orbs drop, you want to avoid those and then run where the first orbs dropped, as that'll be the safety area to avoid the second set of orbs. So it's a slight little dance and will require a bit of positional action. When Akrux is about to go down, Acolyte will then be spawned in and will join the encounter. So you'll be fighting two bosses for a short bit of time, and you want to focus in on Akrux as quickly as possible. Acolyte has a number of attacks, one of them being Purification Protocol, where he'll mark two players to have to spread out. Those players will then deal big group-wide damage to all other players caught in a circle. This effect can be dispelled by at least a healer, so you'll be able to dispel at least one player, while the other may need a defensive or an external in order to live the AoE damage. The boss also does an ability called Flagellation Protocol, where he'll target the tank, focusing down, hitting him very hard, but also very quickly in quick succession. Another ability of Acolyte is Venting Protocol, where it'll make it a little bit harder to stand next to the boss for a short moment as he vents out anima. Taking damage from volatile anima does quite a decent bit of damage to the player, while also decreasing your damage done, and this effect stacks, so you want to try to avoid anima orbs. However, players with the Gluttony debuff from the first boss can absorb anima instead, gaining a pretty sizable damage buff that also continues to stack. So ideally you want to pass this debuff to a DPS player, and Gluttony will pass to a player that's the closest to proximity of another player with Gluttony, so you will want to try to pass Gluttony between the DPS players accordingly. As Acolyte is about dead, Venza Goldfuse is going to step into the encounter, and she only has two mechanics. Chains of Domination will root a player, where you want to DPS those chains as quickly as possible to break the player out. Another ability is Whirling Annihilation, where she'll start to slowly pull the players towards her, and if you are caught in her big cleave, it'll deal giga damage, so you want to try to avoid it. When Acolyte dies, he'll continuously spam out anima out of his body, so these anima orbs can quickly overwhelm the group. So whoever has the Gluttony debuff will have to continuously collect as many anima orbs as possible to try to clear out the effect as quickly as you can, while still you're finishing off Venza Goldfuse. The next boss in rotation usually is Mailroom Mayhem, and the boss has a number of abilities that he casts in a very specific order. The first one being Hazardous Liquids, where he creates circles on the ground which players have to soak. For every one you soak, you take a little bit of damage over time, but it'll also limit the amount of liquids that'll be on the ground to limit the amount of space that is being denied by that ability. Afterwards, the boss casts the ability of Fan Mail, which deals large amount of party-wide damage, which the healer will want to be accounted for. Afterwards, the boss will pick a player with a money order, where they need to stack with other players or use a huge immunity away from everybody else. Either way, expect the ability of Fan Mail, which does a lot of AoE damage, and money order, which can deal damage to the entire party in quick succession, one after another. So a healer will want to be very, very careful with their cooldowns and their output. The next ability in the rotation is going to be Unstable Goods. When the boss is going to throw out these cases, they are set to explode. However, if you pick up a case and toss them into an active event that is currently lit up and has wind rushing through it, tossing bombs or cases into the vent gets rid of them completely, and you want to make sure to get rid of all the cases, all the unstable goods, before they blow up. Where afterwards the boss is going to go into Hazardous Liquids and then continue the train of the same abilities in that exact same order until dead. The next encounter is going to be Miza's Oasis. During that encounter, every player in the group will have to pick an instrument and they'll have to use extra action buttons to hit notes. Guitars, the saxophone, and the trumpet will have a frontal line charge of notes that they need to hit in order to gain a damage buff. The horn will need to position themselves in between of notes to hit them with an AoE ability, and whoever is on drums will need to turn towards frontal notes and hit them with a drum in order to hit all the notes. Usually, if you have a ranged healer, they should be on the drums, as that is one of the easier instruments to play. You just have to position yourself and hit the notes in order to be able to gain a buff. However, if you have a melee healer like a paladin or potentially a monk, for example, then it's actually better to put a range class on the drums, something that doesn't really need to do a lot of movement in order to be able to hit the drums while still being able to reach the boss from a distance. And periodically throughout the encounter, you'll want to hit the notes in order to gain a fairly large damage buff, which you will need for one of the boss's mechanics. And the fight has a very, very consistent pacing to it. At first, you're hitting notes to get a damage buff. Then you'll be fighting 4 adds, one that needs to be interrupted and one that needs to be picked up by the tank, specifically the security add, and be hit by the security add's tank buster. During that time, while you're dodging the adds, you're also dodging swirlies. Then you go back to playing notes, and then you go fighting a second set of adds. Then go back to playing instruments, and then fighting Zogron, the actual boss of the encounter. Zogron is going to have some mimicked attacks by some of the different trash mobs, such as being able to slam the tank with a security slam. The boss will also have an ability called crowd control, where he places a frontal shield, and then after the shield is done charging, he'll send it out into a frontal area. So you want to make sure to get behind the shield to not get hit by it, but also get behind the shield so it's just not absorbing all of your attacks. He also has an ability called Suppression Spark, where he starts to pull players in. This is going to give you an opportunity for all the players that have an instrument to be able to use those instruments to charge out of the middle and escape, while also hitting the notes to refresh your note buff so you can keep a damage window. So players with a charge ability on those instruments, get ready to use the extra button super soon. The boss also has an ability called Menacing Shout, which needs to be interrupted as the attack does a lot of physical damage while ignoring armor. And Zogron's big ability will be Final Warning, where Zogron will protect himself with a force field while starting a pretty big Final Warning cast. You need to break through his shield to then be able to interrupt this cast, but to do so you need to make sure that everybody has hit their nodes the entire time, as the damage buff with those nodes is massive. This is also a pretty good opportunity for everybody to hold their offensive cooldowns for the Final Warning to be able to break through that shield as quickly as possible. And the final boss of the Tazavesh Streets will be Azmi, an assassin that will be using portals as part of the boss encounter. Throughout this boss encounter specifically, Azmi is going to create 6 portals. 2 of them are going to be marked as circle, 2 are marked with square, and 2 are marked with triangle. Stepping in through the triangle portal puts you on the other side of the other triangle portal. So circles, square portals, and triangle portals will be linked, and they'll be shifting around the boss room periodically. The boss is going to use a pretty big ability called Phase Slash, which you just put a bleed on everybody. This is going to be summoned for the group and the healer to heal through or pop defensives through. The boss's big ability for the portals will be Shuri, where the boss will create a circle that keeps expanding, but you can use the portals to get around the circle. Whatever you do, make sure you don't actually get hit by the circle without any major immunity, as the damage it does to you is pretty much a wipe to whoever gets hit by Shuri. As the fight continues and the boss hits 70% and 40%, the boss is going to divide the boss arena. First is going to be down the middle, and then is going to be another divide to create quadrants. So you'll be able to go from one boss arena to then the room being split into 2, and then the room being split into 4 separate sections, which makes it a little bit harder for you to avoid Shuri while jumping from portal to portal, which you'll want to do pretty aggressively. Periodically, the boss is also going to use an ability of Double Technique, where the boss will teleport to another side of an area and cast a cast that is a 2-parter. That means the group is going to have to interrupt this ability twice in a row in order to be able to prevent the cast from happening. Otherwise, it deals 16 million scaling fire damage to everybody every 1 second for 10 seconds, which is basically a group wipe. Now, the other part of Tazavesh is going to be Gambit, which has final 3 bosses, the first one being Hillbrand. Hillbrand will slap the tank with a pretty hard-hitting ability called Shivering Swings, which deals 2 powerful hits in a row, so the tank will want to have a defensive with that one specifically. The boss periodically also casts Titanic Crash, usually the tank, which is a frontal that you can fairly easily avoid. The boss is going to cast Purifying Burst, which deals big group-wide damage to certain players, but it'll also mark the players that are about to take the hit, so if you have a defensive to use during that moment, this is a pretty good time for you to use a personal if you have one. Purge by Fire will have the boss send a beam targeting a player and chasing after them, and that beam will also leave a puddle on the ground. Whenever you're targeted by Purge by Fire, don't stand still, don't have lead feet. You want to be on the move fairly quickly to not take any damage from the beam, as during PTR testing, it did some hefty immediate damage. The boss is also going to be summoning Purifiers, which will be adds that will either channel pretty much a damage reduction, if not near immunity, onto the boss, and whenever they're not channeling that, they'll be casting casts at players. So you want to crowd control them for the channel and interrupt them on the cast, but for the most part, the adds are the highest priority when they are up. After a while, when the boss's bar reaches 100%, he'll cast Sanitizing Cycle, where after a short time, the boss will eventually start to have this ground pulling effect grow throughout the boss arena slowly but surely until it fills the entire boss arena. During that time, players will need to pick up 4 colored orbs: orange, yellow, blue, and purple, that also have a specific marking on them as well for any of you that are colorblind. And the player at the front of the area will be able to interact and channel into a console that will reveal where these orbs will have to go. There'll be 4 consoles, each will need an orb at the corners of the boss arena: front right, front left, back right, and back left. And the console at the front, while it's being channeled, usually by somebody who is not holding an orb, which should give everybody with an orb an idea of where the orbs and the colors and symbols will need to go for every single console to stop the boss from channeling Sanitizing Cycle. The next boss is going to be Time Captain Hooktail, a pirate dragon. The first thing for the encounter is, throughout the fight, the boss is continuously going to be spawning even more ads at the back of the room where the boat is, where the water is, and these ads don't necessarily get fixated onto the tank and they can't really be aggroed. They'll fixate at a random player. So players will, for the most part, want to stack closer together so the ads all congregate within the same general area. The tank is going to get hit by the boss's Infinite Breath ability, which deals quite a decent bit of arcane damage and will stun the tank for a short bit of time, though it can be dispelled. Any ads getting hit by Infinite Breath die immediately, so for the tank it's going to be important to phase that breath towards where the ads are spawning, and if you can use any crowd control, roots, slows in order to keep those ads together, that will only help out the tank in the process. Generally, you want to keep the boss towards the wall as far away from the boat as possible to make it easier for the tank to hit all the ads with the Infinite Breath ability. The healer is going to have to heal over the group, but also manage the debuff of Time Bomb. Every time they dispel it, it deals large amounts of group-wide damage, but also while Time Bomb is on a player, it'll actually increase their haste by a considerable bit. But over time, that Time Bomb will continue doing more and more damage to that player. So you kind of want to let Time Bomb linger for a while so the player gets a fairly nice damage bonus. But eventually you do want to dispel it to manage with the dot damage that it does. And every time you dispel it, it deals quite a decent bit of arcane damage to the rest of the group. So the healer will be in charge of managing Time Bomb, giving players an opportunity to do more damage, but also making sure it doesn't kill them in the process. Periodically, the boss's boat is going to be casting Anchor Shot, hitting a player, doing millions of physical damage to them over 6 seconds as a dot, while also pulling them towards the ship, which will make it a little bit harder for them to position in a good spot. And throughout the entire fight, the boss is going to be casting cannon barrage, or rather the boat is going to be shooting cannon barrages, which will be targeting at players, so you'll want to move around the boss arena and avoid as much of the fire as best as possible. Also, don't touch the water. If you touch the water, a hungry shark sneaks up on a player, killing them immediately. So you want to try to stay away from the boat and the water as best as possible while moving the boss, and keeping the boss generally away from the boat to give the tank as much of an easier time hitting all of the ads with that big frontal. The final boss of Gambit will be Solia, which will have 2 phases and an intermission. In phase 1, the boss is going to cast abilities like Hyperlight Spark, which will bounce to all the players, doing a bit of AoE damage. Summon Assassins, where the boss will, as explained, summons assassins, which will need to be cleaved down as quickly as possible. At some point, periodically, assassins will cast a spell which needs to be immediately interrupted, otherwise it deals way too much damage, but abilities like Grips or any crowd controls will also be good enough to be able to interrupt their cast as well. Another ability the boss will use is cast a Collapsing Star, which needs to be soaked by a player 3 times. However, every time you soak it, it'll put a dot on everybody else, so you want to stagger those soaks. So you want to soak it, then let the dot fall off before you soak it again. Usually the healer or a ranged class will be in charge of managing the soaks. When the boss reaches 40% health, she'll go into intermission, regaining her health all over again, while also gaining an empowered like Archon style form. The boss will create 5 relics on the ground, and players will need to stand near those relics. There'll be a line, a beam that'll pass through all the players, and you'll see a line on the ground. You want to make sure that that line hits every single relic in order to be able to break the boss out of an immunity phase. During phase 2, the boss is going to cast an ability of energy fragmentation, where she'll empower the relics and shoot out these energy fragments, which are basically lines that you'll want to avoid. Keeping the boss away from the relics will make it easier for you to dodge all of those relics lines. Another ability you want to dodge is Hyperlight Nova, where the boss will create an eruption around herself and the relics within 14 yards, which you just want to run out of. During that time, the boss also still continues to cast Collapsing Star, where you'll now need to gas off 4 charges on the star before it erupts, and functions exactly the same as in part 1, just somebody, a range class, ideally should go over there to gas it off, usually after an energy fragmentation. So wait until the relics erupt the spokes outside, then you should have a player go over to try to gas off the star slowly over time. When the boss's bar reaches max, she'll cast Hyperlight Jolt, becoming immune yet again, and players will need to position themselves around the 5 relics, having this Hyperlight Jolt pass through the relics in order to remove the boss's immunity. And every time you miss a relic with Hyperlight Jolt, that damage of Hyperlight Jolt is going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. So you want to make sure that you get those relics the first time or even the second time around if at all possible, removing the boss outside of immunity until you eventually take her down. But with that, as always, I wanted to thank all of you guys so much for watching and hope you guys did enjoy this guide. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like, as I would very much appreciate that. Also helps videos reach a wider audience. Join our community, especially if you want to keep up with any new patch 11.2 changes or potentially any midnight announcements, which should be happening sometime soon. Also, let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.